My night has begun. All right, guys, this next performer, I have a great pleasure of bringing up. He's kind of like, I don't know how I would personally describe him as a prognosticator of future economic events. Somebody was like, "Oh yeah." He's got a way of being, and he's very entertaining, and I love reading and watching this guy. So put your hands together and show a lot of Mr. Peter Schiff.
I do a lot of public speaking, but I mostly talk about the economy. I talk about the financial markets. But a funny thing is when I give these lectures, I get a lot of laughs. And a lot of people will refer to me as a stand-up economist. So I don't know. I'm going to just go over some of the things I discuss, and we'll know in a few minutes if the things that my audience has been laughing at all these years are actually funny. So one of the things I talk about a lot is the national debt. Right? We have. All right, you guys are making this easy. Well, the national debt is like $17 trillion, right? And that's not the funny part. But anyway, and that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? We have the unfunded liabilities, the off-budget items are enormous. But let's just deal with this $17 trillion, because I talk about the fact that there is no way that we're going to pay this money back. We've just borrowed too much money. And the only question is, how are we going to default? And the major economists, the mainstream economists, always say, look, Peter Schiff, you don't know what you're talking about. We don't have to pay the money back. And I'm thinking to myself, we don't have to pay the money back. I mean, we borrowed it. Have we discussed this with the lenders? Did the people who are loaning us all this money realize that we're not going to pay it back? I mean, for example, we have a lot of short-term debt. The maturity is very short. So in the next 12 months, about $5 trillion comes due. Right? We got to pay back the $5 trillion. And they say, no, we don't have to pay it back. You see, we're just going to borrow that $5 trillion to pay it back. And so so that's our plan. Right? The plan is we're going to borrow $5 trillion from the new investors to pay off the old investors. Yeah, that's the plan. Well, I mean, does anybody here know anybody else who kind of operated his whole business under that plan? Anybody know? Bernie Madoff. All right. Bernie Madoff. Right, the U.S. government runs a giant Ponzi scheme. And it's actually not just me saying that. Bernie Madoff, when he first went into jail, he gave an interview. And in that interview, Bernie Madoff said, why are you guys even talking to me? The federal government, the U.S. government, is running the biggest Ponzi scheme in the world. And, of course, when that article came out, it was a big story. Immediately, the mainstream media, the economists were saying, well, come on, that's Bernie Madoff. He doesn't have any credibility. Who cares what he says? Well, I mean, he's got credibility about one thing, right? Ponzi schemes. I mean, he knows a Ponzi scheme when he sees one, right? That's why... At the time, that's why I said we shouldn't have put Bernie Madoff in jail. We should have made him the Secretary of the Treasury. And I'll give you a perfect example of why he would be a much better Secretary of the Treasury than our last secretary, who was Timothy Geithner. If you remember, we had a debt crisis. It was in all the newspapers a couple years ago, the debt ceiling. We weren't going to raise the debt ceiling. Well, do you remember what Timothy Geithner said was going to happen if we didn't raise the debt ceiling? Right? He said we were going to default on our debt. If we couldn't borrow more money, we were not going to pay back any of the money we've already borrowed. Right? Now, see, Bernie Madoff would never say something like that. See, Bernie Madoff knows, I mean, this is basically Ponzi 101. Right? When you're running a Ponzi scheme, you don't tell anybody that it's a Ponzi scheme. You keep it quiet, right? You at least pretend that you're going to pay. You say, well, we're going to raise taxes or we're going to cut spending. You don't tell the bondholders that you're not going to pay. Now, I also talk a lot about the Federal Reserve, right? Now, quantitative easing, right? You know what that is, right? It's a euphemism for inflation. That's all it is, right? But the Fed doesn't want to say that their monetary policy is to create inflation, because the people know enough to know that that's not a good thing, right? So when they first came out with QE1, Now, of course, they didn't call it QE1 initially. They just called it QE. It's only QE1 because it didn't work, and so they did QE2. And that's how they do things in Washington. If it doesn't work, you just do it again, right? And you just keep doing it, right? The definition of insanity. But when they announced QE1 or QE, and they finished it, I said, well, they're going to do another one because I knew it wasn't going to work, right? I know that quantitative easing is like trying to put out a fire with gasoline, right? Doesn't matter how much gas you put on, the fire is just going to get bigger, and so you're going to keep throwing more on it. So I said we'd have another one. Then sure enough, we had QE2. And then I was saying, well, we're going to have more QEs than Rocky movies. and so we did. Then we had QE3. But before we had QE3, right, we had Operation Twist, which I was calling Operation Screw. But then we had QE3, which became known as QE Infinity. But then, Paul Krugman came out and said that it's still not big enough. But now we've got all the QEs. Now they're talking about the exit strategy. They're talking about tapering. Now, I was saying years ago, when they did the first QE, I said that there was no exit, that they had checked into the Roach Motel of monetary policy, that there was no way out. And now there are some people, some mainstream economists that are saying that, yeah, maybe it is going to be a difficult trick to shrink the Fed's balance sheet. A trick like, pulling a table out from under the dishes. That old trick, if you yank the tablecloth, and if you do it just right, you don't break the dishes, right? So that's a tough trick. That is not the trick that Ben Bernanke has to perform. I'll give you an idea of what he has to do. The trick Ben Bernanke has to perform, he has to take the table and yank it out from under the cloth. And he has to leave the cloth and the dishes suspended in midair. That's what he has to do. Now, also, this is the only new material you guys I'm doing tonight. This is all from stuff from my lectures, but this is new. This is legitimately new stuff. So, I get fan mail. Not that many stockbrokers get fan mail, but I get a lot of fan mail. And one in particular, I'll share with you because I laughed a lot about it myself. All right. So the letter comes to me from a executive producer at Vivid Entertainment. Now, some of you guys out there who are like, what the hell is Vivid Entertainment? What is that? Is that, they make adult films, right? Pornography is what they make, right? So I get a letter from this pornographer. And he says, I'm a big fan of yours. And anyway, I know you have an office in Los Angeles, which I do. I have two. He says, so you're out in L.A. We'd like to have you come down to the set. We'd like to introduce you to the stars, show you how the movies are made. You can bring some of your brokers down, I'm sure they'd like it. I don't know what my wife would think about it, but this is where it gets funny. That wasn't the funny part, Scott, because I kept reading down the letter. But he says, the real reason we want you to come down is we want to shoot a movie starring you. And he says that he thinks it will be a good move for my career. And so I'm thinking, yeah, why didn't I think of this myself? I mean, I went from stockbroker to radio talk show host. I mean, pornography, porn stars, obviously the next move for me to make. In fact, I know a lot of people, you try to figure out, what would your porn name be? Because I've had such a good porn name, and it's been such a shame that I haven't been able to use it all these years. My name is Peter Schiff, right? My porn name would be Peter Stiff. And that's a great name. And I already can see my movie. My first movie would be Peter Stiff in Ball Street. It's not just his money that's hard. And then I also thought, because Vivid Entertainment, I don't know if you know this, some of you guys, Vivid Entertainment is like the only porn company that uses condoms, right? And so I was thinking, maybe, he meant opportunities for my business. Maybe he meant like cross-marketing. Maybe I could put my logo on those condoms for the close-ups. And, some of the guys, they're pretty well endowed. I can get my entire 800 number. Maybe I can put my website URL up on those condoms. But I thought about it, and I realized that it's probably not for me. I don't know if people would take me seriously if I was doing porn. And you know, I ran for Senate a couple years ago, and people asked me, "Are you going to run again?" And I'm thinking, you know, I don't know if I'm going to run again, but certainly, if I were to be a porn actor, that might do something to my political ambitions. And then I thought about it, and I said, well, wait a minute. You know, if I'd have started my porn career a few years ago, right now, I could be the front runner in the mayoral race right here in New York City. But anyway, that's it.
Keep going for Peter Schiff. Or as I will affectionately call you, Mr. Stiff. He put a lot of thought into that porn stuff, didn't he? He was like, damn, this really could be a business opportunity. I watch porn and I don't even think about it that much. He came up with a name. Hey, I got a good idea for a film starring you. Peter Stiff is occupying some anyway. All right, the next person coming up on stage, Ryan and Mark tried to get this person to do this show for 7 years. They were stalking her, sending her nude photos of themselves. And if you've seen Ryan and Mark, you don't want nude photos.